And at the end of the day, sometimes you don't get the all-stars. And so there was a nurse that was really struggling. And before he would have yelled, but he stepped back from the field and said to her, all he could see was his eyes, capped math. He said, I know this is difficult. It's hard on me and it's hard on you, but we'll get through this. And he leaned forward at the table with me and said, Karl, you wouldn't believe it. You could see her eyes relax, and Karl, she actually sped up after that.
Welcome to Medical Money Matters, the podcast where you can find experts, answers, and resources so that you can achieve mastery over the financial and business aspects of your practice. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Medical Money Matters. With me today is Karl Pister, who is a longtime healthcare executive coach who works with healthcare leaders and physicians in the community, both on talent development and also at times when professionals need a little bit of a helping hand. So, Karl, welcome. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you so much. Delighted to be with you.
All right. Well, I am so fascinated by the whole notion of an executive coach, and I would love to hear how you talk about why a physician leader might want to engage a coach.
Atul Gawande wrote a marvelous article back in 2011 in the New Yorker magazine, and the title is Why I Use a Coach. And he notes that most high achievers, be it music, be it athletics, use a coach, not necessarily to do basic skill development, but skill development at a higher level. Mm-hmm. He talks about himself using a coach to help his surgical style, observing him in the OR. And so anytime that a leader is wanting to get better, it's usually good to have someone by the side helping him or her see those things that probably are missed because we rarely see ourselves accurately.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I love Atul Gawande's work, and I know in many of his works he references the work with his coach and how. And I always had to smile because I consider him to be a professional at the top of his game, right? That's, and very thoughtful with it too. And if I recall, at least one of his books I read, and perhaps the use of the coach led to the checklist manifesto. But his description of it and the fact that he had measurably better outcomes after using the coach. Including having his infection rates go down and all of that. Again, that was I thought a great example of humility in a leader as well. Given
well said, absolutely,
yeah, it's wonderful. Well, thinking a little bit about humility brings me to this notion of emotional intelligence, and you talk about that on your website. So I would love to hear you reflect on how you see emotional intelligence and its impact on a leader.
And we have 3 hours to answer this question.
Yes, exactly. We'll be here all day.
Many times, hyper smart people have climbed the ladder of accomplishment just on their own. Mm-hmm. They are the top of the class. They get the top in the SAT in high school. They get the top MCAT score. They are recruited left and right by the Harvard, Stanfords, John Hopkins of the world. And then they hit a level where they're no longer an individual performer. Mm-hmm. And then they have to work with people. And they haven't had any training for that. Yeah. In fact, because they're so smart, many times they've been given the get out of jail free card by, well, Jane's a little awkward, but she is so smart. Her math scores are perfect. And Jane goes up the ladder, and then suddenly she's asked to be a section head
Mm-hmm.
of her surgery department. And I recently had a case. This woman is brilliant and she has no filter.
Ah,
And so sometimes when a brilliant person shares insights without a filter, people walk away not feeling enlightened, but feeling like they've been run over by a D9 Caterpillar tractor.
yeah.
And so, literally, emotional intelligence has some key platforms: self awareness, awareness of others, emotional reasoning, being able to manage in crisis, and being able to lead positively.
Mm-hmm.
And any any exercise in the emotional intelligence arena needs to give the person a framework. So when they're in a setting that they don't feel like they're swimming in quicksand,
Mm-hmm.
but they can ask themselves some key questions. How am I presenting? Have I listened well? Have I connected with the person? Do I know the emotion underneath? Do I know the story underneath
Yep.
what might seem like a really harsh stand? When someone's done a great job, do I take the time to acknowledge that, even in a busy surgical environment?
Mm-hmm.
Um, just small things. The platform I use has, under those 6 areas, has have 7 reference points that a client can go to when they're stuck, and we can do that in the coaching, or they can do that on their own. But I I think it's Maya Angelou. She may not have been the original author to this phrase, but I'm sure you've heard it, Jill. People don't care they won't remember what you've done, but they'll always remember how you made them feel.
Exactly.
I just butchered a beautiful quote, but I think as leaders, sometimes people forget that they are dealing with humans,
Mm-hmm.
and these humans are the ones that will carry out the strategy
Yeah.
or the good surgery. And even though you had a good huddle before the surgery, if suddenly the surgeon then turns into Jekyll and Hyde, um, and yell, and I've heard people say, "Well, I needed to yell at her. I needed her to do better."
Mm.
And it's, oh my goodness, no! By yelling at her,
Right.
you kicked in the fight or flight, which shut down her creative brain, which disallowed any improvement. You biologically shut that person down.
Yeah.
And so, what I find encouraging with coaching, I'm working with such hyper smart individuals
Yes.
that when they can see the logic and the payoff
Mm-hmm.
to some of these thinking changes, that it just, I had one surgeon who sadly was at the very end of his career ask me once, why didn't anyone teach me this sooner?
Mm. There's
Because he saw the payoff.
right.
He
Right.
he told me the story. He was a cancer surgeon. They were in the midst of a very difficult surgery, and just due to hospital, he was now on his third shift change in this hospital,
Wow.
in this surgery.
Wow.
And at the end of the day, sometimes you don't get the all-stars. And so there was a nurse that was really struggling. And before, he would have yelled, but he stepped back from the field and said to her, all he could see was his eyes, capped
Mm-hmm.
mask. He said, I know this is difficult. It's hard on me and it's hard on you, but we'll get through this.
Wow.
And he just he leaned forward at the table with me and said, Karl, you wouldn't believe it. You could see her eyes relaxed, and Karl, she actually sped up after that.
Wow.
So
Okay.
story after story about
Yeah.
smart people learning. It's just a new language.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have to change, because sometimes the physicians will say, well, because I work with a lot that are in their 50s and 60s, and they'll be telling me, well, I'm not going to change. I can't change. I am who I am. And the response to that is, I completely agree. What we're doing, though, is teaching you a new language,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and when to use this language and when to use the other one.
That's far more accessible, I imagine.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
And you just can see their defensive level drop.
exactly like not yelling at the nurse in the OR.
Yes. Yeah. Yep.
Oh, wow. I'm sure there's a book that needs to be written from all the stories that you have from clients.
Oh, and I think one aspect that would help coaching so much is if those that have benefited from coaching, because I've done this when I could be assured that confidentiality and the
Mhm.
right procedures were in place. I've had one of my docs phone one of the newer ones that was kind of reluctant to get into coaching because coaching still has the stigma
Yeah,
of, well, you've done something bad or you wouldn't be getting a coach.
yeah, yeah,
And he said, Karl, if I can ever help someone, get on this coaching path, let me know. And after clearing again all the confidentiality stuff, he did. And it was just, oh, okay, so this could work. Great.
yeah.
So
And
to get the message out there that an organization is investing in this improvement path.
yeah, yeah. As opposed to it's a, recovery from something bad that you've done.
Yeah,
Rather, it can be an investment in you as a leader going forward.
absolutely.
Oh, that's wonderful. It is amazing to me that there is still, as you say, that stigma out there around a lot of things. And I've had a lot of conversations with physicians about the shame culture that we still have in medical school. I keep asking the young medical students when I meet them, or have we done some work to reduce that a little bit? But there's this you need to have the knowledge and you need to be at the top of your class, and
Yep,
yeah,
absolutely.
that's I think there's still work to do. To have people coming up in a place where it's not only okay but it's encouraged to improve your performance, and however you do that, that's
Absolutely.
but your comment earlier about the many of the people who are successful coming up as an individual producer is a great one, and that leads me to a question around when you first meet with a clinician who has been successful as that individual producer and now is then being asked to lead something and is finding it challenging. What are some of the ways in which you work with those folks?
Most highly successful people have arrived at that level because they're known as doers.
Mhm.
Give it to Jane, Jane will always get it done. Give it to John, he's amazing. Guys, he just works 24/7. It's great. And so they're still in their, what have I done today? I've got to check off the box. And when they're introduced to the simple concept, and I've just got a chuckle of listening. And it's almost okay, and after I listen, what? Well, let's get listening down first, and then I think most of the other answers will come. And so, literally, one of the first skills that a physician that's moving into leadership has to do is be able to put the brakes on that hyper smart mind
Mhm.
in order to find out what the people around the table are thinking. I had a medical director, just a great guy, superb physician, and he was an internist. And he said, Karl, the very things that make me a great doctor make me a lousy leader.
Wow. Okay, there's some
Because
insight. Yeah.
he's coming in, he's running a clinical day. He has 35 visits that day on his schedule.
A lot. Yeah.
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 He's running, well, 8 hours at 15 minutes each.
Yep. Yep.
And so his job is to, Karl, the patient, is to get in, make some connection fast, but drill down immediately, ask me a lot of questions, formulate a diagnosis, and get me done maximum 20 minutes, and now I'm already 5 minutes behind.
Right. Right.
And now in my new team leader role, I'm sitting in front of a 2-hour meeting and I start in, got to drive it, got to drive it, got to drive it, instead of, Jill, what do you think about this? And Jane, what's your view on this?
Mm-hmm.
And to learn that the worst thing he can do, um, using the example of this medical director, is give his opinion soon.
Mm-hmm.
Because in the world of medical hierarchy, once the doctor has spoken, we just kind of fall in behind the diagnosis, even though we're not diagnosing anything because there's no patient. There's just 8 people on his team that are looking at him, wondering how he's going to lead. So the very first thing, let's just spend a little time as you take over this team, finding out where they want to go, finding out what each of them runs well off of,
Mm-hmm.
because generally, and I may be throwing myself under the bus here, but I don't think I'm unique. When I sit down with Jill and with Dr. Wright, it is my thinking that generally we're all on the same page. We're about the same age,
Yeah.
we're about the same experience. So what Carl's thinking probably is what Jill's thinking.
Yeah.
It's not that far off. And Dr. Wright, known him for nearly 20 years. I know him well. Probably. And what a fatal assumption.
Yes.
Because we might agree on X, but we're talking about Y.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And yet all it takes is Carl, the new leader, to say, I'm new in this chair, and I'd love to know, Jill, what are your thoughts on X?
Mm-hmm.
And then take really good notes. Steve Covey talked about this 40 years ago in 7 Habits of Highly Successful People. Seek first to understand, then be understood.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Brilliant.
yeah.
And funny because we all knew it 40 years ago, right? And how often do we take good advice? There's a
And I think in the simplicity, we sometimes trip ourselves up. As a good leader, I must be doing, there's lots of must be's,
mm-hmm.
but unless my team knows I listen to them,
Yep. Yeah.
Andy Stanley's a real famous podcaster, and he has a great phrase: those that choose not to listen will soon find themselves surrounded by people who have nothing to say. And
Yes.
that always makes me squirm in my
Be
seat.
careful what you attract, right? Yes.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Oh, that's yes. That I'm actually sitting here having my own squirm moment with that one. Yeah. Well, I love the notion of listening. That's my old joke is yeah, 2 ears, one mouth. Use them proportionally. Yeah.
Well said. Absolutely.
Ah, and it is rather amazing that we are continuously we've built this system, and I use the big community we've built the system in this way that doctors see patients, and it thoroughly discourages learning or listening. It just there's just no time built
Yep.
in for that, and yeah, and we see those statistics that are kind of frightening about it's measured in minutes how long the physician generally listens to the patient before they interrupt.
Yeah.
And yeah, yeah, that's yeah. But we could have a much longer conversation about that sort of overarching
Oh, yeah.
construct how we do patient care in the U.S. That's we'll save that for another podcast. That's a whole nother one. So thinking about your leaders that you coach, I'm sure you have some that come to you after they've gotten some constructive feedback, which is the polite speak for negative feedback or some behavior they need to change. And sometimes they need to change it pretty quickly. How do you coach those people when they come?
Great question. Um, our research would indicate, and Gallup has done phenomenal research on this for decades, and they've come up with what is called, you've probably heard about this, the Strength Finder model.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we have found that it is best to deal with constructive feedback, i.e., you're messing this up, but we'll put in a euphemism for constructive.
Exactly.
So, doctor, you really need to get this better. And so she comes to me with the feedback. Um, Even the smartest of people can get beat down pretty fast.
Mhm.
And so here's a surgeon. She is an ace. She is a cancer surgeon. She is just phenomenal. And she's got some feedback, and this is back to my other example, that she can run over people really fast in a meeting.
Mhm.
And this really upset her because she thought she was just being straightforward.
Got it.
So, what we did was make sure that we got other feedback, and I knew enough about her to know that she has one of the most tender hearts on the planet. Um, she will go extra mile to help people. She will room a patient herself if her MA is busy.
Mhm.
So, the first thing is to find what they do well. And sometimes the person is a little put off because, but Karl, I've been criticized on this. Great. We will deal with that, I promise you.
Mhm.
But let's look at what you do really well. And what values do those tie to? What abilities, what experiences, what stories can you tell me about those? And then we weave in what needs to improve on the traction they already have and the reputation they already have of being superb in other areas. And again, what I don't care how smart a person is, there still is that feeling inside of, did I mess up yet again?
Mhm.
And so I think a coach needs to be a strong advocate for their client in acknowledging, yes, we really have to work on this, and let's tie it in to what you do well.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that I've just seen, I had one neurosurgeon stand up at the end of maybe our second interview, and he'd gotten beat up pretty bad. And he just took me, gently and appropriately by the shoulder and said, Karl, you've got to believe I'm not a bad guy.
Mhm.
And it was kind of, oh, because
Yeah.
his, um, his chief of surgery was telling me some of this person's abilities. Brilliant surgeon,
Yes.
absolutely best guy you'd want opening up your skull.
Yep.
And yet at certain points, as his chief of surgery said, this doctor is superb 98% of the time and blows himself up in the other two.
Yep. Yep.
So he came in saying, Karl, I got to change the two. Yes, and let's leverage it off the 98.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's do some strategic changing here in the 98
Mhm.
so that the two disappears. You won't need the two when you do the 98.
Right. Right.
And you just can see them thinking, oh, so this isn't the MEC, this isn't the medical board.
Right.
This is an this is a chance to really get some skill development in a very positive environment.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, there are times when the feedback is so severe that as a coach, you do need to join the chorus of severity and help them know that this really isn't optional. Because if this happens again, their history at Hospital X,
Yeah.
because the MEC will, I have been told, and I always get permission, can I share this? Did you realize, doctor, that if this occurs again, your privileges are gone at this hospital? And there's been some times where I've heard, no, they never told me, but generally the eyes go down and you understand that.
Mhm.
Okay, so that's understood. Now let's go back to the 98 and 2 again.
Yeah. Yeah.
And sometimes it's 50-50, and sometimes it's 20-80.
Go
And you
go to whatever the good parts are. Let's work from there. Yeah. Yeah.
exactly, because if they're aware of they're aware.
Yeah.
They might be defensive, but they're aware.
Yeah.
So again, we don't ignore the input, but let's use what traction we have to
Yeah.
weave in the improvement with the solid what they have going for them.
Yes, yes. Well, and I'm glad you mentioned StrengthsFinder too. I love that tool.
Mhm.
In fact, we use it with our whole team, and we publish the grid where with everybody and their strengths, so that it helps your coworkers sometimes if they're driving you a little nutty. You can go back to that and say, "Oh, well, they're really good at this, this, and this, and those don't happen to be my strengths, so maybe I really need them." Um,
And on just a quick tangent there, Jill, I was working with a nursing team in an ER environment, and we actually, it's the only time I've done it, but it worked really well. We got all 34 and we focused top five, bottom five.
yep.
And it was so enlightening to see what the bottom was and how that could be brought up by emphasis on the top five.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it was fairly revealing because sometimes people look at StrengthsFinder and think, oh, it's just one step up from a horoscope.
Yeah.
And there's only 75 questions. It only took me
Yeah.
15 minutes. Come on.
Yeah.
And then they look at all 34 and they realize the Gallup organization absolutely knows what they're doing
Yes.
with this strength finder.
Very well researched.
Oh, yeah. You can't run from that one.
Yeah. Well, I was really excited to get mine done the first time I had finished the whole survey. And I was speaking with my mother a little later, and I was telling her, just use this exciting tool and named off the top five. And there's this pause. And she said, well, I could have told you that. You know, thanks, Mom.
Oh, yeah. That's great.
Saved you the $15 for the book and the 30 minutes online. Yeah.
Yeah, no kidding.
But we've actually just used StrengthsFinder recently with a couple of senior physicians who'd been in practice together for more than 20 years, inside of a larger group, and they had been really instrumental, the two of them, in building this group, and they had come to complete conflict over something that occurred in one of their board meetings, and the administrator called, and I said, great, we can come in and start having some conversation. And that was one of the things we did, was to give each of them strengths finders and then ask them to share their strengths with each other.
Yeah,
And that was a very nice way to, begin
great idea.
bridges. Yeah. Yeah. And really to start like you do, start the conversation with what's working and where you have traction.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I love that as a tool. And one of our earlier episodes, we went through several of them, and StrengthsFinder is one of my favorites. And I hadn't, prior to that engagement, I hadn't really thought to use it in a situation of high conflict, but it really did. It helped just reset the conversation, and
Yep,
remind them
absolutely.
of why they've been partners for so long, and all the things that work. So yeah. Um, I was curious, again, looking at your website, one of the things that you offer in the community is a mastermind group. And I've
Mhm.
become more fascinated with that notion over the last few years. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the construct of that and why you would encourage leaders to have a mastermind group.
Oh, love that question. Brief history on the mastermind. It was formulated originally, as I understand it, this comes from the writing of Napoleon Hill in his book, The
Mhm.
Law of Success.
Yep.
He was commissioned by Carnegie to talk to the top industrial minds of the last century. So we're probably looking at about 110 years ago.
Mhm.
And Wrigley, as I understand it, was the one that adopted this, where he brought in great minds around him, contrarian minds and agreeable minds
Mhm.
that would help him think into problems. Fast forward this decades, and now what we find, and a good colleague and I run these mastermind groups a couple of times a year, bringing people together, usually in groups of around 9 to 12,
Mhm.
and it's a confidential environment, and people can talk about any challenges they're having in the workplace and get. And it's funny that my co-facilitator Shandy Welch and myself, um, we always brainstorm. You know, what are we going to teach in case there's no issues brought up? And we've done this. I think we're in our fifth group now,
Mhm.
and we've never had to use our
Never
backup plan.
actually had to use the material.
Well,
I love
I,
that.
I ran one group at a hospital of nurse managers. And the goal was the nursing director wanted us to go through a book and wanted the mastermind to facilitate that. And so I went through and I had curriculum set up every 2 weeks, a chapter today. I was wired and ready to go. And at the end of 6 months, Jill, I think we were on chapter 3. Be-
Great progress.
oh yeah, because the people, the consensus was, Karl, we can read the book on our own, but we met 90 minutes a time twice a month.
Okay.
And we studied the book a bit, and then they'd bring in issues they wanted to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the issues they wanted to talk about were much more pressing than the book. And so the book kind of got shoved to the side, and it was just so amazing what this group did over the 6 months.
Good.
Um,
Yeah.
and I think the culmination was on one of our final meetings. We had our agenda, we were ready to go, and one of the people came in late, and she was just ashen. And she had just come from the ER with a very, very difficult situation. And I was a facilitator leading the group. And to see them, I just stepped back. And to see that group pull around this woman and walk her through exactly what she needed to be walked through. And the confidence level of the group was so high that there was no hedging on the seriousness. They read her like a book. And the trust over the 6 months had grown to a degree that she could open up about the horror that she had just been through. And to see for those 90 minutes, those team members come around this person and just walk her through a very traumatic event. Switching to another group, this was a very eclectic group. We had healthcare, we had industry, and we had a CEO in the mix.
Mm-hmm.
And he was the only CEO. And he ran North and South America for his European-based operation.
Okay.
Multi-$100 million of budget. And the other members of the group were very smart, but nowhere near his executive level.
Yep.
And so I was a bit concerned about that, but this guy was a great learner. And so on one of our meetings, he said, Karl, I don't want to preempt anything here, but I'm in a really tight situation. I fly to Europe tomorrow, and I'd like some input. And I'm thinking, he's meeting $1 billion board, and if I use the name, you'd instantly recognize the company, so I won't.
Mm-hmm.
But these are big players in industry.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, okay. So he brings it up, and for the next hour, this group completely set him up for success.
Beautiful.
Just because they listened, these were smart individuals. They did not have his level of CEO experience, but they had human experience.
Mm-hmm.
And they had person-to-person experience that he did not.
Mm.
And he came back on the next meeting, and this is a guy, he's ex-military, he's rough and tumble.
Yeah.
And with emotion in his voice, could not thank the group enough for a very successful meeting. It didn't go the way he thought it should, but it was successful.
Wonderful.
And he left with some new insights that were key for him.
Mm-hmm.
But he wouldn't have done it if it hadn't been for that group.
Yeah.
So 2 examples, and we keep having repeat people come back.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and and we always ask, why'd you come back? And it's the comment is, I don't get this in any other place.
Yep.
Confidential, complete. You've got 7, 8, 9 other experts
Mm-hmm.
around the table that may not, in the CEO example, not at that level necessarily,
Mm-hmm.
but with expert experience in other realms, and it just never fails.
Yeah.
Our only problem is our 4:30 stop time. We usually run from 3 to 4:30, and people are still talking and they've got to go to other places.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
love Mastermind.
That's so great. That's the sign of a good party when people don't want to leave.
Oh
That's
yeah. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's I love the example. Thank you, both of the examples. I've been blessed to be involved in a group that wasn't set up as a mastermind group originally, but we've been meeting monthly for about 10 years. And very stable membership. We're very selective. They're all leaders in healthcare adjacent businesses, and it's been beautiful and a huge contribution to my business and my career over the last 10 years. And I continue to think about setting up others, and I'm a little confronted, like, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to replicate the magic that I already have over there.
Yeah.
So I continue on, but that group's actually becoming a professional, like a not-for-profit association. Like it's getting really official
Good for you.
after
That's
10
excellent.
years. But yes, and that is I like to say it's a butcher, a baker, and a candlestick maker. There's an attorney and an accountant and an architect, and all people who are senior leaders with lots of great experience, like you described your group that was working with your CEO in the mastermind. And they come up with some very creative
Yes.
thoughts that are just completely out of the box for me, but they have different perspective, and it's so valuable.
Well,
Um,
speaking of different perspective, I was at a healthcare conference in September, and we had the senior vice president for um, personnel at Common Spirit out of Denver,
mhm.
Sebastian Girard, brilliant presenter. And talking about a different perspective, he talked about a program NASA has where they bring in high school seniors once a year to talk about their their most difficult situations. Here's a NASA engineer describing to a high school senior. Now these are brainiac seniors,
Sure.
granted.
Yeah.
And why do they do this? Because there's such a newness
Mhm.
that some crazy ideas can come up. And his point was that they solve at least one of these problems every year because this butcher, baker,
Yeah.
candlestick maker, high school senior
Yep.
comes in with well, have you thought about this?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And, here's this, I use the word probably too much, brainiac NASA engineer who's responsible for getting people to Mars and back saying, we'd never thought of that.
Never thought of that. Yeah.
So
There's
it breaks a myopia that sometimes we have in our professional silos.
Yeah, I like that notion. I talk about the power of naivete sometimes, that you come in and everyone who's new to our organization is welcomed. And I say, please open your mouth a lot. Like, tell us what you see that's
Yeah.
different. Tell us what you've learned from other places, because you haven't yet been drinking the Kool-Aid here, and yeah,
Yep.
you haven't developed that myopia around how we do things and how we think about things. So
I
I love
I think it's in his book, Hardwiring Excellence, but Quint Studer
hmm
talks that one of the most overlooked interviews in American industry, and especially in healthcare, is the entrance interview.
Yes.
We exit interview,
Yeah.
but it gets to your point. What did you do in your last place? Why did you do it? What are we doing that's good? What are we doing that you're thinking, why are they doing this?
Right.
And harvest, and I love the point, before they get indoctrinated Kool-Aid wise
Yeah.
into the present. Boy, what a great concept.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I love Quint Studer's work too. I'm a fan.
Yeah.
I just read his book, The Calling. his most recent one. A beautiful collection of stories about people in healthcare, and effectively saying, it really, thankfully for all of us who has patients, it is a calling. It is still a calling for many, many people in healthcare, and what a noble profession it is. And I love to hear it
Mm-hmm.
described that way. That's wonderful. Well, as a wrap up question, I think you and I could literally talk all day. I think as a wrap up question, I would love to ask you to just reflect on what advice you would give to a physician who is an aspiring leader in their group.
Great question. Lots of different directions on that. But I think it was John Maxwell who said, you cannot lead well unless you can lead yourself well.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I would again, please take the time to take yourself apart a bit and see what makes you go.
Yeah.
What are your values? Maxwell asks, what makes you cry? What makes you laugh? What makes you dream? And you might think, oh, please, could we cut the fluff? But those are three things.
Yeah.
What do you get excited about? How do you come across with that? What are your values? Because values are what drive thought, thought drives feelings, feelings drive behavior. So unless you know your hard drive, and a lot of people don't, Carl Jung had this great quote, until you make the conscious unconscious. Let me flip that. Until you make the unconscious conscious,
Mm-hmm.
it will direct your life and you will call it fate. So, aspiring leader, you've spent 35, 40 years, 20 years of an adult life forming stories, forming narratives, forming opinions, all based on deeply held values. So identifying those and knowing how those make you run.
Yes.
When do they make you upset? When do they make you angry? So you have to know that.
Yeah.
And then to know human psychology enough to be able to listen well, get well versed in some of the classics on leadership. One of my favorites is The Leadership Challenge by Posner and Kuznets.
Okay.
It's required reading for upper level at Intel.
Mm-hmm.
They talk about the 5 basic areas of leadership. I would definitely get a copy of that book.
Yeah.
I would immerse myself in good leadership writings from McKinsey, from Harvard Business Review. Make yourself a learning leader.
Mm-hmm.
You can't inspire people unless you're getting inspired yourself. And you can't inspire others unless that inspiration in yourself is an ongoing personal development plan.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I think good coaching comes in, or good mentoring.
Yep.
If you're part of an organization that truly has people dedicated, set aside time every couple of weeks to pull you aside and say, Jill, how's it going? What are you struggling with? Who can I connect you to?
Yeah.
A good coach will do that. A good mentor should do that. So know yourself, know your values, be a learning leader, have a personal development plan. And then, like we mentioned earlier, become a fanatic of listening. Lou Gerstner took over back in, I think it was 92. IBM was dying, and they brought in Gerstner from RJR Reynolds.
Mm-hmm.
And his joke was, I don't do tech. In my last job, I sold biscuits and cigarettes.
Yeah.
Because people asked him, Gerstner, what's your view? What's your vision for IBM?
Mm-hmm.
He says, I have no idea. I need to find out what our vision is.
Mm-hmm.
In the first year, he flew over 400,000 miles on the corporate jet, going all around the world listening.
Mm.
And he would cut people off when they were going into corporate speak. He said, no, I want to really know. He sent an electric shock through the corporation because back in those days, they used overhead projectors. And you didn't speak at IBM unless, as they called them, your foils were perfect.
Yeah.
About two foils into the first presentation, he stood up and put his hand on the projector and turned it off. And he said, I want to hear what you're thinking. And it went worldwide overnight. He wrote a book about it, Who Says Elephants Can't Dance? Speaking about this monolith of IBM that completely changed because he listened, he chose the right people, and he led brilliantly because he knew what he was about.
Yep.
And he knew emotional intelligence well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of those things, Jill, if you and I had bought IBM stock in about 2001, we may not even be talking today.
Might be retired. Yeah. Oh, I love it. Well, that was a fantastic synopsis. Thank you for that. And thank you for the time today and just sharing your experience and your wisdom and all of the specifics with our audience. Much appreciated.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. It's the leadership path is one, as you're aware, that never ends and is so incredibly rewarding. When someone comes back to you, Jill, 10 years from now and says, you probably don't remember this, but, and they share with you something that you did for them, a door you opened, a time you listened, a time you guided, a time you just asked good questions. And that's when you start to realize the all-encompassing nature of leadership and how a coach can really help guide at some early stages.
Absolutely. Thank you again, Karl.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
All right. You can find more information online at medicalmoneymatterspodcast.com, and you can also find examples in my book, Physician Heal Thy Financial Self, which is available on Amazon. We've included those links in the show notes. As I like to close out these podcasts, congratulations on taking the next step in your professional development and for making the commitment to learn about the financial and business aspects of your practice. I look forward to being on this journey with you, and I send you my heartfelt gratitude for all that you do for your patients all day, every day.